You may have noticed from our beautiful surroundings and some of the other events that are taking place today, nous sommes en France. And this conference has gone to a certain extent, the argument of this conference, as Albert and I talked about it, was very much to embrace many of the historical shifts that have taken place over the last 25 years since the 75th anniversary, which meant in many ways a decentering of the events. But this certainly should never mean that we discount the importance of Europe in the events. That would be foolhardy at best, and particularly France. We tend, perhaps, as we're very far ashore, we may forget that much of the fighting did take place in France. The losses in France were tremendous. And the question of France's place in the world, and France's place in Europe, France's place in the world in the wake of the 1919 peace was absolutely central, both for the French, but also for Europeans and far beyond, even as we learned earlier, if we speak about Ho Chi Minh, right, in Vietnam. Certainly. So we have invited two leading scholars of 20th century France, of French history, Alain Chatriot and Georges-Henri Soutou. And it's with great pleasure I will introduce them one by one before their talks. And so we will begin with Alain Chatriot, who is professor of history in the Department of History at Sciences Po. He is an award-winning specialist of the interwar period, received the bronze medal from the National Council of Research. The bronze medal, I should be precise, is not third place. It's first place for an up-and-coming scholar, and so it was a great achievement. He has been the editor of the Cahiers Jaurès, and now Political at History Journal at Sciences Po. His publications include a sort of dizzying number of articles, reviews, and contributions. But he has also published 3 very important books on social democracy in France, the politics of wheat in the interwar period, and a biography of the French politician Pierre Mendès France. And so Alain was, as the French would say, il a rempli une commande, but I was very interested to hear his thoughts about sort of the evolution of the way the French have thought about World War I and the peace treaty, and the role that the peace treaty has had in French historiography. And so he was kind enough to offer this contribution. So thank you, Alain.
It's a great pleasure to participate to this very interesting scientific meeting. I want to thank my colleagues and friends, Professor Sawyer and Vu, for this invitation. But for me, with a pleasure, I'm afraid that it's hard too. Not only because my so bad English, awfully sorry, but maybe more because it's hard to speak, not only Saturday afternoon, but after Professor Tse Ki-hon and before Professor Soutou. Before to propose my historiographic talk, so be sure not so technique, but precise on French historiography for Versailles Treaty, I want to begin with 2 quotations, more political than historical. But I think it could help us to understand the French political situations just during the negotiation of peace. My first quotation is here. My dearest mother, the peace has now been signed. It remains to be seen how it will be executed by the enemy, since we know it well enough to know that it will do nothing, said nothing, pay nothing, that it has not been forced to do or said or pay anything without some form of coercion and even some final brutality. This is the only method we may use in this particular enemy's case. Its commitments are a mere smokescreen, its signature a poor joke. As the years go by, Germany will recover and will become increasingly arrogant, and in the end will not pay even close to what they owe us. It must be feared, moreover, that our allies may soon become our rivals and will be relatively indifferent to our fate. End quote. Maybe you know who is the author of this quotation. He is, in fact, the young Charles de Gaulle. This letter was written in Modlin, Poland, by Charles de Gaulle to his mother, and it has the advantage of quite accurately reflecting the common view shared by French military circles at the announcement of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. As a counterpoint, one may also quote part of an article published on the front page of a French newspaper in July. And this short quote. It was thus up to the socialists to imagine that a war led by bourgeois governments and a peace decided by bourgeois statesmen could lead to law and justice. It was somehow forgotten that capitalism created inequity, egotism, and greed just as trees feed their fruits. Yes, it was up to the socialists to carry within themselves, to maintain around themselves such a foolish faith. We thought that this war would really be a war of law, end quote. It's a more complicated quotation. In fact, it's a quotation of Léon Blum in L'Humanité, it's a newspaper from the socialists, with this title of Victoire et Paix. And the idea for Léon Blum is to explain that the socialists have the hope that this First World War, more precisely a part of the French socialists, have the hope that the First World War could be a war of law. And I think that it's important to think linked with the discussion of this morning. Obviously, the register of a private letter and of an editorial in a political newspaper are not the same. But these two texts do help to remind us of the differences among the historiographical analysis in French, which I would like to discuss today, and this kind of politicization of the question in French during this time of negotiations for peace. My talk is very simple. I want, in the first part, show the classic and central subject of modern history that the Treaty of Versailles is. And after, I want to underline a few renewal of this historiography. And I think that examples that I've chosen could be help to making a bridge with all the talks that we have from yesterday. A classic and central subject of modern history, and on this point, the most important and the first figure is Pierre Renouvin. Because, in fact, Pierre Renouvin, wounded during the war, moved away from his first works on the French Revolution. For a very long time, we should think to that. Modern history for the French university at this end with French Revolution. And Renouvin was one of the people who proposed to integrate 19th and 20th century in the French University for the History Department. Before teaching at the Sorbonne, he first conducted an investigation that was supported by the Library of the War Museum, and in fact asked by Raymond Poincaré, but Georges-Henri Sautou know quite well this question, so I just evoke that. In particular, Pierre Renouvin published a remarkable book on the forms of war governments, which has remained a classic of political history. This volume, I don't have the picture, but this first volume in 25 was part of the vast project led by the Carnegie Foundation, which then helped to write an economic and social history of the World War. And it's very important because this vast program is directed by Nicolas Butler and James Trotwell, and Renouvin was one of the French historians to participate to that. After this first step, Renouvin writes a first synthesis in La crise européenne et la Grande Guerre for the first edition in 34. But this first work ended with the armistice. He concluded its introduction with this short commentary. Quote, the armistice of the war marked the end of an era, when allies led the struggle together. With the peace conference, the physiognomy changed. The solidarity of combat was broken. The states that just the day before had joined forces toward a common end returned to their mutual mistrust. The long and harsh discussions in which the treaties were elaborated were already marked by a spirit that was different from that which existed during the war. The problems that were being debated were thus that, for years, remained the foundation of international relations. The peace conference was the preface to the post-war era, end quote. And that's why the book ended before the peace conference. And I think that the first point with this example is the idea of course, when Renouvin had written these pages, we are in 34. And of course, the question of the dissolution of the international alliance is a main point. After the Second World War, Renouvin proposed a cours at Sciences Po, my institution, on les relations internationales in French. And in this course, he commented the Versailles Treaty, but very briefly. And I think it's interesting too. After the Second World War, Versailles Treaty is not the truly important question for these people. After Renouvin, the second historian directly concerned with this question is Jean-Baptiste du Rosel. Renouvin then offered a summary of the questions, this book, and for a very long time it's one of the books in French, the most important on the question to have the basic knowledge. Jean-Baptiste du Rosel, his student and successor at the Sorbonne, pursued this research within the history of international relations and devoted an important biography to Clemenceau. And these two important French historians helped to publish, not only, but helped to publish an important book during the 50s of Paul Mantoux. Paul Mantoux is an academic and acting officer within the Council of Four between March and June during the peace negotiations. And this very important book is the documentations constitute a foundation for a lot of writings on the subject. After that, Renouvin and du Rosel promoted an approach to international relations that pushed beyond the specific field of diplomacy, but they sought to understand in particular the reactions of public opinion to the major issue of war and peace. And on the Treaty of Versailles, Pierre Miquel delivered in the early 70s a vast project, a vast research project. I don't want to comment precisely, but of course, the kind of way to consider public opinion in this book is a little updated. I think that I could say like that. But the most interesting point of this book is its systematic consideration of all the French newspaper. And so it's very interesting to understand the French debate, political, social debate during all the peace conference. After that, we have other approach. Professor Jacques Barietti on Franco-German relations after the First World War, and more recently, of course, the very important and magistral study of Professor Soutou. And the particularity of this book linked with his PhD is to underline the importance of the economic issues before, during, and after the First World War. After that, we have another short book, but very interesting, from Jean-Jacques Becker to propose a useful synthesis on the Treaty of Versailles. After all these important works and books, I want to underline the kind of what I think that we could call an historiographical renewal. In fact, the Treaty of Versailles was therefore a subject that was already well known to historians, since it had been at the center of the rise of modern history in France following the Second World War. But alongside these early studies, a range of complementary projects provided insight into important points within the development of peace. This renewed interest should no doubt be linked to two phenomena. The more general renewal in history of World War I, particularly important for French academics, and I think that we should to remember of that, linked with the geopolitical events related to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the return of the border issue to Central and Eastern Europe. About 15 years ago, a number of the famous books that had analyzed the treaty when it was still very present in people's minds were republished. And I think that it's a particularity that we should think. The first republication is, in fact, a double public edition, the text of Keynes and the text of Bainville. But it's not the only re-edition. Maybe more original, the case of the book of Étienne Mantoux, in fact the son of Paul Mantoux, a young French intellectual and economist engaged with Free France during the Second World War and died just before the end of war. His book was published first in English with this beautiful title, The Carthaginian Peace, and in French it's for the first edition Raymond Aron who prefaced this book with this title, La Paix calomnie. And I think that it's interesting that not thinking only to Keynes and the answer of Bainville, the classical historian very linked with the extreme right, but to think to the, an economic answer to Keynes with Étienne Mantoux. And more recently, with the presentation of Georges-Henri Soutou, we have a very important book, well known by the specialist, but I think that we could say, well, a little forgotten for the authors, La Paix from André Tardieu. And why this book is very important? Jean-Henri Soutou could say more of me on this point, but because Tardieu is a direct collaborator from Clemenceau during all the process. And his book is very interesting to understand quite well the French, not only idea, but part of negotiation on a lot of points. Recently, too, another case, very interesting, I think, because, and it's a pleasure in history, we could find original documents. In fact, a colleague, archivist and historian named Odile Gauthier-Voiturier exhumed a correspondence of a figure of the Parisian elite, Élienne de Nalèche, head of the important newspaper, the Journal des Débats, who wrote letters regularly to a friend who was in the war. And in fact, Nalèche, with his position in Parisian world, is very often in contact with the American delegation during all the process of the negotiation. Only one quotation. In April, he has written, quote, "There is no doubt that we give the impression of being insatiable, and we only have yourselves to blame. We wanted to refine at the beginning, we waited forever to draw out something broader, and now we cannot even get what we are entitled to receive. Opinion is mounting against Clemenceau." And I think that this kind of letters could help to understand, of course, a small part of the Parisian world, but very interesting during the negotiation. The history of international relations has seen new systematic investigation into the preparation of peace, and I want to see a few unpublished, but I think very interesting. First, the work of the PhD of Vincent Lagnol, particularly questions the preparatory phase of the conference with a lot of diplomatic archives. But maybe more original and linked with the debate of this morning and of the beginning of this afternoon, I think that we have new works, new research on non-state agents too, and particularly to the question of expertise. And the PhD of Nicolas Ginsburger on the geographers, or the works edited by Isabelle Davion, show us very precisely the question of borders. And more of that, the advantage of these works is to show how the discussion is not only a discussion of the big three, of this old white man. And of course that all the questions are totally discussed, particularly with academic expertise on a lot of points. If the economic stakes of diplomacy had already been highlighted by Georges-Henri Soutou, further studies on this subject have also been published in very recent years. We now, for example, have a better understanding of a figure that we took this morning. I'm sorry for the quality of the picture. Étienne Clémentel. Étienne Clémentel, who was one of the founders of the International Chamber of Commerce, but who was one of the key men in French diplomacy during all the conflict and its final moments. And I think that this book, it's a collective project, not only another biography or another scientific meeting to celebrate the memory of people, but a collective project will discuss very precisely all the trajectory of Étienne Clémentel. Less known, but very interesting, certain aspects that were less visible from a diplomatic history perspective were also rediscovered and shed light on complementary aspects of the peace negotiation. And I want to quote this book from her PhD from Emmanuel Danchin on the time of realms. And it's a very, very interesting book. And in fact, she showed the commitment of certain artists and conclude that, quote, the principle of Germany having to replace the equipment looted or destroyed by factories during the war should, it was thought, apply as much to artistic clauses and be included in the clause of the future Versailles Treaty. And in fact, this could be more investigated. During my readings for this talk, I find this picture in Lens in April. In fact, it's a delegation of the peace conference who want to see the question of the ruins of the city of Lens in the north of France. And the French newspaper, le Grand Écho du Nord-Pas-de-Calais, precise in its title, pour le châtiment. Avant de dicter aux vaincus les volontés des vainqueurs, les délégués à la conférence de la paix visitent les ruines de Lens, d'Arras et de Denain. So the question of the ruins are linked to the negotiation, and I think that it could be very interesting. To conclude, only a few points. Recent and future scientific meetings in Paris on this point. Recent scientific meetings, so unpublished today. The first is very interesting because it's questioning, first of all, the question of the archives and of the sources of the treaty. And I think that it could be a very good way to investigate this question. And I want to comment very briefly the last future scientific meeting, because during our colloquium, we have no comments on this point. Of course, Versailles is the creation of International Labour Organization with the part 13 of the treaty. And this question is particularly important, and I think that the celebration of the International Labour Organization should be a very good moment to think to all this history, the beginning, but all the century. So, I finished. I think, of course, it is only a short historiographic panorama, only from the French, and with this kind of scientific meetings, of course, when we read the program, we see that today it's not only the French who speak to the French for the Versailles Treaty, but on all this question, it's time to listen the true specialist, Professor Soutou.